This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Reverend, I was privileged some years ago to meet Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. His family escaped from Syria, from the Ba'ath regime there. He has served with distinction in the United States Navy. He's a recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal, and he's a respected physician currently in private practice, specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology. Obviously, he chose the easy subjects to get through school. And past president of the Arizona Medical Association, just a great human being. Dr. Jasser, welcome to the Rev The Rabbi.
Oh, it's an honor to be with you both, Reverend and Rabbi, and so much to talk about. It's just we're the Syrian community just overflowing with emotions right now.
So, obviously, the first question should be Syria. Step forward toward freedom, step backward. Do we know? What do we think?
Well, if only my grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, was alive and my father were alive to see this day, because they escaped in the 60s, the same regime that ultimately solidified under Hafiz Assad, the father, and then Bashar. And listen, there's many cancers in Syria and across the Muslim world, but the metastases usually come from a primary tumor. The major tumor in Syria was the Assad regime, a fascist militant regime that pitted what we thought was one of the most viable countries for democracy. Why? Because of its diversity, because there are so many faiths between the Christian community, Chaldean, Assyrian, and the Druze, the Shia, the Sunni, the Kurds, the Turks, and others that are part of Syria, made it almost where they had to not have an Islamic state, where they had to have a secular liberal democracy, but yet the dictatorships fueled a tribalism that you could not feed and you could not treat unless that went away. And you know, as I sat back and watched for decades, we thought it was never going to change. They brutally killed 800,000 since 2011, and 10 million of the 22 million in Syria were displaced. And make no mistake, Syria, since its independence in 47, went through 20 different coups up until 63, and the Ba'ath have been in power. And the Ba'ath party was taken over by a sort of marginal sect of the Shia community called the Alawites. And the Alawites basically have created a relationship with Iran. Fast forward to the last year, October 7 changed everything. Obviously, Israel was attacked by the radical Hamas that was being fueled by Iran. And they now are fighting for their existence to try to appropriately decimate Hamas. And Hamas not only was getting aid from Israel, from Iran, but also from Hezbollah. And Israel appropriately had to decimate Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that was what shifted. 3 weeks ago, all of a sudden, everything changed because Hezbollah was no longer able to be available for Assad, and Syria was abandoned by Russia and Iran. And actually what is not being reported is that Israel shut down the connections between Iran and Russia because they said, you're not going to transmit weapons, you're not going to do any of that. So a band of a small number of rebels was able to walk across the country without really firing too many bullets. And the regime just melted away, and Assad left and changed a 60-year-plus regime just vanished after decimating one of the most horrific 3 generations of the Middle East.
Doctor, I have to ask you this question because our audience can assume that, number one, you're not Muslim, but you are. You're an American Muslim, and yet you speak in this way on this particular issue. What kind of a Muslim are you if we were to classify Muslim. We're not monolithic in our Christian faith, Rabbi, of course, in the Jewish tradition. But how do we understand you as a Muslim?
Well, I just came back, actually. My wife and I were in Oxford, and I was debating. The topic for the Oxford debate was whether Islam is compatible with democracy. And I, as a devout Muslim, opened my speech and said, as much as I love my faith and I have a close relationship with God, I would be lying to you if I felt that Islam is compatible with democracy, and it is not. And I told them, I said, if I was sitting in Oxford in 1600, if they had a university then, or wherever, any universities in Europe, and we argued whether Christianity was compatible with democracy, you'd say no. It took until 1789 in which you had a country that separated and understood the biblical passage to render unto God's what is God, and unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And Islam has not gone through that. We're 1,445 years old. As much as we've had a renaissance, I mean, there was a time, you could say that, well, Islam then is not compatible as a faith, but there was a time in which the Elon Musks of the world were in the Islamic world. Bernard Lewis wrote about the Jews of Islam and the work of Maimonides and so many other, brilliant intellectuals that were doing their work, where there were 4,000 different schools of Sharia from the west to the east, and now there's 4. And there's a consolidation of thought. And now you have the wealthiest people in Islam spending $500 billion on building an empty city in a desert in Saudi Arabia, rather than building institutions of higher learning, of humanism and understanding art and music and poetry. They're not doing any of that. So, there are no free markets of thought, free markets of production. They're just stealing ideas from the West and not doing any of their own work. So there's no reform. So if you wanted to label me, I'm a reformer. I'm no different than the Calvinists or the free thinkers, the Voltaires and others in the West that were, many of whom rejected religion, but I love my faith because of my own interpretation. My father's translation of the Quran that translated what Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Wahhabis and others interpret in a very theocratic supremacist way, my family interpreted it in a very personal way of a personal description between God, discussion between God and an individual, and not God and a state. And thus, the Quran should be a source of law, but not the source of law. And that actually is the main difference between an Islamic state, like we are very fearful is going to come next in Syria, as it came next in the Taliban, Afghanistan, and it came next after the Shah in Iran, and it came next in Pakistan, which is the Islamic Republic. So over and over, we see this playing out. But I will tell you, you can't get to stage 3 unless you go through first stage 1, which was military dictatorship, then stage 2, which is political Islamism and the Islamic State. But in Syria, it's going to be different because it will fail. Number one, the most important thing, second to the loss of Assad, which was we were cheering from the rooftops, but I was cheering even more, wishing that I was in the Israeli jets as they were bombing all of the MiGs and the missiles and the chemical weapons depots and the jets and the helicopters that they destroyed just in the past week. That actually is more ensuring that it won't be used again against its own people or against Israel, and it will allow people to go through the maturational process of reform that a military dictatorship like in Egypt, we saw the Brotherhood failed, and the deep state came back with its military, and the NDP is back running it like a military state, and there's no reform happening in Egypt.
So what you're saying...
Follow-up question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this because you were raised as a Sunni Muslim, and here you are, very articulate in terms of your position with regard to Islam, its political use. And is this because of your educational journey that you come to this point?
Well, it's interesting. The reason I am what I am is because of my family and also because of America. I grew up, but I also was rooted in a very strong relationship with God. Before I understood how to do the interpretation and understanding of what Quranic passages, it said, for example, in a passage says, don't take Jews and Christians as friends. In fact, the word is not friend, it's awliya, which is illegal. Or another passage that says, cut the hands of those who steal. I was taught that that is not cut, it's sever them from society, ways to interpret it. But before I learned that, I was raised to have a very strong personal pietistic relationship with God, and that the Quran is it's just scripture, it's God's word, but you bring your moral capacity to the Quran. You don't get it from a book, you get it from your personal relationship with God. So that personal non-clerical approach to Islam was something that I teach my kids, that my wife and I tell them, your life is about your example. It's not about, what somebody tells you to do. You choose your own future, and God is judging you on everything you do, how you treat the people with you, how you treat your patients, your work, and your parents and your kids. So the moral character is what's so much missing. So the Islamists only get away with what they do because of the corruption and tribalism and dishonesty and propaganda and hate and all of the superficial nonsense, is that at the end of the day, you can't reform. And this is why I do the work I do, is that if good Muslims who have a strong relationship with God don't take back the reins of our faith, it's not going to be reformed by secularists that are nominal Muslims. And just like if you read de Tocqueville, he talks about democracy in America, and he says, listen, America is was successful because you didn't need military dictatorship, and they were God-fearing community and Christians, but they didn't want Christianity in the Constitution because they wanted to have a personal relationship and not fight over which form of Christianity. And that's exactly what I think the Islamists try to do in our faith, is co-opt and theocratize Islam.
Dr. Jasser, years ago, I remember you as this courageous, committed person that you are today, and you appeared in the hearings that took place in Washington. Congressman Peter King was very much a part of that. I think he was the chair of the subcommittee on terrorism. And I felt you were a lone voice. Has that voice been strengthened by others who take the position you do? Is it still a lonely battle, or do you see this movement for this reformation growing?
It's certainly growing, and the education process over time, I've lamented many times, it's taken longer than I thought it would. I was deluded into thinking that the Muslim communities would feel a sense of urgency and a sense of trying to give back to the West the freedoms that they got. But I will tell you, the successes we've had have been, number one, in moving the needle on the words, the lexicon that's used. I think Islamism is understood now and used on regular media much more so than it ever was before our hearings and before a lot of the work that we did. So people understand that Islamist is not just terrorists, but it's those who want to put into place Sharia law and have the Quran be the Constitution and have the flags be about Islam versus Western secular national states. And I think if you look at our movements, our Muslim Reform movement has now 40 to 50 different Muslim leaders in small organizations. We're still in the startup mode, but at the end of the day, we are a formidable group that our declaration, which is 2 pages, which says that, the reason we're reformers is, number one, we believe we don't have an exclusive path to God. We believe that we're equal with other children of Abraham, and that there's equality between men and women, that a person's sexuality is theirs to decide on their own, and we're not theirs to judge, that people have freedom to criticize clerics, criticize Islam, leave Islam, and it's not a cult. So a lot of these aspects are part of our 2-page declaration, and that's been out for 10 years, since 2014, and it's not been taken apart. It's basically withstood the test of time, and now we've formed a bigger coalition called Clarity Coalition, which stands for Champions of Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny. And people can go to claritycoalition.org and see we broadened that to include a lot of the think tanks that you know well, from Hudson to Gatestone to Middle East Forum and Heritage and so many others in the West and in Europe and in Canada that now are doing a lot of the counter-jihad work and pro-Israel work that we believe in strongly, that are now helping us, because we can't do this alone. We realize that if you just wait for Muslims to do it on their own, the vast majority of Muslim countries are still pre-modern. And you need folks in modernity in the West to begin to take sides within the House of Islam, and that's what Clarity Coalition has been doing.
Mm. Have you been criticized because of your relationship with the Jewish community?
Those who criticize us are the Islamists. Back in 2003, if you look at our website, one of the 17 principles we had for people to become members of the American Islamic Forum was you have to recognize the State of Israel. And I was embarrassed to have to put that up there, but we had to because, bottom line is the Islamists by definition have demonized. And I like, in the political world, they talk about Trump derangement syndrome. I've been talking about Israel derangement syndrome forever, in which many of these folks, many of the Islamists have demonized a very normal secular democracy in the Middle East, and intentionally, as has been known in history, that the Jewish community has been suffering through repeated targeting and repeated, as we've seen on campuses now and elsewhere. So, it really is a way to ferret out those who are Islamists, because you can't take a religion in which a passage says that we may intermarry with Jews. A Jewish woman may be the mother of our children, and it says, do not convert her. She may keep her faith. So how can that be allowed and yet demonize the religion? And then they try to say, well, we're just anti-Israel, we're not anti-Jewish, when in fact, obviously, the anti-Semitism about their approach to Israel is very obvious.
So look at Syria now. People celebrated the downfall of the Assad regime, so they've tasted a little bit of freedom. Israel has destroyed, as you mentioned earlier, a number of the military assets, the leadership of Hezbollah, Hamas. Do you really think that now we're going to go back to this ISIS-controlled rebel group controlling the all of Syria? Do you see that? Or do you see all these different rebel groups? Or do you see the possibility of going forward in a whole different direction?
I look at things like a doctor, and whenever I talk to folks about this, I tell them, listen, we already determined the 20th century foreign policy of the West, especially American foreign policy, in which we looked at the Middle East like a Game of Thrones, in which we picked our friends, we picked our king, and we said the enemy of our enemy is our friend, and then we said, oh, there's no downside, at least we picked the lesser of evils. It's not ours to pick, number one. Number two, we thought that the Assad was never our ally because of his Russian affiliation, but the monarchs that have been our allies, Al-Qaeda is a byproduct of Saudi Arabia. And Qatar right now is one of the biggest problems. So one of the things that have created the Jolani movement, which is HTS in Syria, is Turkey. Turkey is still a member of NATO, so they're a strong ally, and yet they're probably one of the most dangerous regimes growing near the Middle East, if not with the Middle East, in the past generation, because Erdogan is an Islamist, caliphate leader wannabe, and he's working with Qatar and Iran to try to rebuild that neo-caliphate that is really the OIC that he's controlling, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So the Game of Thrones era is over, and I think Syria, you can't, if you look at Iran right now, as dangerous as Iran is, and we have to make sure that they never get nuclear weapons, they cannot be at the stage they are now, which is in which you see a women's revolution happening, you see a pushback against the theocrats. They could not have gotten to this without having gone through these 30, 40 years of understanding the evil of theocracy. So as long as these countries don't get nuclear weapons, let them mature and understand the problem with theocracy, just like Europe. The most dangerous period in European history was the 30 Years' War, in which 8 million Christians perished fighting against theocracy. So, yes, it's going to be a bloody period in Islamic history, and Israel needs to make sure it's protected, and we need to stand by our ally. But let them grow through it. Let's not say, oh, let's help the next dictator come, while that dictator foments groups against one another and creates. Why do you think it needed America to get rid of ISIS? America had to get rid of ISIS because Assad wanted nothing to do with getting rid of ISIS. He was letting them grow in order to legitimize military dictatorship, just like Saudi Arabia tells us, oh, if we leave, you'll have Al-Qaeda running Saudi Arabia. Yeah, they created that eventuality, because it legitimizes their military control. Egyptian government did the same thing, and now we lost Iraq to Iran. I mean, the Game of Thrones thing has to end, and we have to let them mature. And Syria, I think, might go through an Islamic period over the next 2 to 3 years, but eventually the Kurds, the Alawites, the Sunnis, the Shia will have to come together in a coalition government that will not be Islamist.
We're going to take a break here and come back with more conversation with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, the Rev The Rabbi.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC and the all-new WABCRadio.com.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Speaking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Yeah, Doctor, you did a documentary-style film back in 2008. It was called The Third Jihad, and Radical Islam's Vision for America. And this is still close to 9/11 and the conversation in the United States around Islam. What is a Muslim? Are they all radical, etc.? Fast forward, you did several other films and ended up having one shown to the New York Police Department recruits as a training video. Do you still believe that this is a major threat to America because they want to fashion a new kind of America? And that has a lot to do with their presence here, or no?
Absolutely. I would ask anybody to go and look at that documentary. It's not dated at all. It's evergreen. And it is about, if you look at the Islamists, they, in Arabic, divide the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. And in Arabic, that means the land of Islam and the land of war. So whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Khamenei in Iran, whether it's the Islamist Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, or from the Muslims in India to all over the world, the Islamic theocrats view anyone who's not under Islamic majority rule as being either peripheral or part of the land of war. So they have not rejected that mentality. As much as Giuliani in Syria wants people to believe that he's reformed, not only was he killing Americans in Iraq under Nusra Front, but they see the West as the problem. And at the Third Jihad, we got a lot of heat for it because, the America still and the West still is so susceptible to identity politics and a sense of feeling guilt and some of that, all guilt issues do start with a kernel of truth. So, yeah, our colonial era, and if you look at President Trump, appropriately now there's a populist move to say, hey, let's not interfere in foreign countries, etc. But at the end of the day, colonialism, as bad as it was, it brought, the French brought education to Syria that had been, through Ottoman control, had been decimated for some time. And so there were some good things, but at the end of the day, colonialism is not freedom. It's not liberty. And the Third Jihad is about their jihad to use terrorism and allow these offshoots of radical groups and the Muslim Brotherhood movement on the Sunni side and the Khamenei movement on the Shia side to put the West on defense, and as their offense spreads, and this is my response to it, is that we should be on the offense and not apologize about Western ideas. And today it's much worse. We saw with BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, the red-green axis evolve, which was this axis between the far left and the Islamists globally, where the Code Pinks of the world were working with Tehran, and the Black Lives Matter movement was a far-left movement here, identity politics, but was working with the deepest anti-Semites in the Nation of Islam and others. So this movement together was working to put the West on defense. So our film, The Third Jihad, talks about those things in the prisons and universities and others long before people even knew what DEI was or any of this.
How do you respond to the accusation that the training film that was used for NYPD was one-sided and made Muslims look like the enemy, and it was propaganda? How do you respond to that?
That's a great question. I don't see it as one-sided at all. I think what's one-sided is the billions upon billions of dollars spent by the petro industry to create the word Islamophobia and institutes of Islamophobia and other identity movements that somehow racialized Islam. That seemed to be one-sided, where all of a sudden they lump Muslims all as one identity, and we're a minority that's aggrieved rather than a diverse community that has many interpretations of a faith, and that the Islamists don't speak for us. That's been what's one-sided. What's one-sided is all of the Muslim Brotherhood groups that speak from the same hymnal about anti-Israel, about pro-Palestinian. After October 7, what was one-sided was how every Islamic group started to say that somehow Palestinians were the victims and couldn't even utter one ounce of compassion about the horrific crimes against humanity that were done against the 1,200 plus Jews that were targeted on October 7. That's what's one-sided, and none of them are calling for the war to end by saying release the hostages. That's what, to me, I can't believe how one-sided that narrative is.
So how do we Jews who are under attack on many university campuses, how do we form some kind of constructive coalition with Muslim leaders such as yourself and combat this in a way that stands against, this propaganda? When you see so-called intelligent students, informed students, globalize intifada, we stand with Hamas, that requires a response that can't just be on the defense, but as you say, should be on the offense.
Absolutely, and that's why in our Clarity Coalition we talk about an offense to save the West, is that what's at stake here is not just Israel. And if you look at history, whenever the Jews have been targeted and anti-Semitism starts to rush through the veins of those who are, overtaken by this evil bigotry, it then permeates society into a tribalism and into a suppression of free speech, suppression of critical thinking, and you're seeing, a glorification, as you saw in the universities now, of not only of Al Qaeda and Hamas, and I couldn't even. You were talking about when I testified to Peter King to Peter King in the hearings. At that time, we had just put in jail Holy Land Foundation board of directors for funding Hamas, and at that time, we had in our documentary, A Third Jihad, a clips of CARE folks recognizing and saying that they support Hamas, et cetera, and they were standing away from that, saying they don't. Look how much we've descended. Now in universities, throngs of students are defending Hamas, and people think that's normal. And this is a terror group that just beheaded folks on camera with GoPros. We have gotten so radicalized, and this radicalization process is something I've been testifying for years on, and we're seeing it happen in the Democratic Party and the folks on the far left. It's not just radicalization of Muslims, it's radicalization kids from UPenn that all of a sudden think that their healthcare system is broken, so why don't we assassinate the CEO of United Healthcare? This is what's happening with radicalization. It's easy as a doctor to see the pathway that can create that, and the way to counter that is not just to say it's wrong, but to save the West and say that we have core principles that make us American, that is Americanism. So you fight Islamism not by saying that Islamism is bad, but by saying that Americanism, being a national believer in the Constitution and the separation of powers and family values and other things that are who we are, that's how you fight it in a positive way. That's why we say our coalition is champions for liberty against the reality of Islamist tyranny. So you can't just say what you're against, it's what we're for.
Would you apply that same critique to Christians in America who are looking to influence American society through a theocratic Christian government here in America?
Well, I hear what you're saying. I get that question a lot. And, the interesting thing is that we can't have this conversation in an ahistorical way, meaning that the discussion of the separation of church and state in America and in the West is in the 21st century. It's not in the 17th century or 18th century. So Islam, the conversation we're trying to have, and Islam, it's barely in its 15th century, and it has not gone through a process of determining what is, separation of mosque and state, and how do you have a society in which you can actually, Bassam Tibi quoted it best. He wrote a book on Islamism, and he said Christianity became a stronger faith in which the secularization of Christianity actually allowed it to become more personal and more pietistic rather than governed through, mandated through government. So now as we look at the discussion in the 21st century, 200 plus years after the Constitution, this conversation is very different, where you have a hyper-secularization that's creating a response where people are coming back to their faith. I think if you look at the far left, whether it's discussions of climate change or whatever it might be, some of those conversations are a new religion. It's become a atheistic cult-like discussion, and it's a normal response for folks who have a strong faith to say, no, wait, our response is not to be ashamed of what is a man and what is a woman, not to all of a sudden abandon mental health problems and just call it homelessness. There's real issues that are solved by the core family values. And I think that's where the American discussion is about church and state in 2024, going into 2025, versus the discussion I'm having in Islam is a historical one that the West already went through, which is about enlightenment and about not, getting the establishment out of religion, out of government, and not letting religion establish itself through government control and thus through the legal instruments, where we can have arguments in the legislature and our Congress about life, but not say that we're doing it because Scripture so-and-so says so, but because this is our value. And yes, you're right, there are some folks who push that envelope, and I do disagree with them. I'm more secular on those things. But at the end of the day, let's not mix the two periods in history.
So let me ask you something about... Let me ask you about...
Go ahead, Rabbi. Go ahead.
Let me ask you about American foreign policy. We were in Afghanistan, and that was a lost battle. We were in Iraq. That was a lost battle. I mean, is there more thinking that needs to go into policy before we get involved in this way?
Absolutely. And, I've said this, I ran for Congress earlier this year, and on the trail, folks were telling me about, how much I supported the Iraq War. And, I said, listen, many of us did. And we thought that the problem was just these dictators, and then realized that, our blood and treasure should not be spent on trying to bomb people back into democracy. That doesn't work. But at the end of the day, yes, I agree. I've matured on that, and I believe that these are not only their problems, and I still have always said that, America picking the dictators was a problem. Mm-hmm. So the foreign policy, I think, is more about being present in the war of ideas, if you will, in the free market of ideas, but only needing surgical interventions, just like Israel has been doing very, very effectively, where it targets the scientists that are making nuclear weapons in Iran. It targets the heads of Hezbollah. It targets the heads of terror organizations. And, I think that type of example is something that we should, moving forward, do for national security. But when it comes to global security, just as much as we shouldn't have interventions militarily, but also we shouldn't, cozy up to Russia, cozy up to, the worst policy, I think, in the last two generations was the open door to China, in which we become so economically dependent on the world's greatest enemy that it's a problem. And the same thing with Saudi Arabia. The best thing that can happen is for the Saudis to have nowhere to sell their oil so that they collapse, and ultimately you end up having them have to evolve through Islamism back into democracy, and the Islamists are defeated, organically rather than from externally.
Doctor, I'd like to circle back to the hypersecularization that you referred to, because in our election, this has been, very a very deep divide in America, socially and politically, around, this presidential election. President Trump has been the face of it, of course. A very interesting personality. But would you say that the hyper-secularization of which you speak is the reason for the major conservative shift in the social and political landscape here in America?
Well, I think, it's interesting. I think the major shifts we saw is not the hyper-secularization. It's because of the suppression of free speech. I mean, as a doctor, I saw things happen in this country that I never thought would happen in the United States. We shut down businesses. We made choices for families based on one virus. And, okay, I understand maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks, but it went on for months and months and months in which we had to resort to printing money from the government because the government decided that whatever price needed to be paid, it wasn't up to families to decide that this virus was something they wanted to either confront or not, but they shut down their businesses and everything. And if you said anything, you were marginalized. You had to wear a mask. You had to get vaccines, and we were forcing them to get treatments, and et cetera. And if you countered that, so a lot of the conservative movement on the right was responding to that aspect of critical thinking, which is all part of the bigger cultural battle than about, DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, in which they were telling us that you couldn't, if you questioned certain individuals that were either of a certain protected faith or protected sexuality or protected gender identity, that somehow you were a bigot. So this whole free speech issue, I think, is what drove a lot of the political dynamic that the hyper-secularization issue. I mean, they were shutting down churches during COVID and synagogues and leaving alone parades and other things as if it didn't matter, or Black Lives Matter rallies and marches downtowns, and they were tearing apart malls, et cetera. That seemed to be okay, but they were shutting down churches. So, no, I think hyper-secularization is one of the symptoms. The bigger issue is suppression of free speech.
Interesting. So, Dr. Jasser, we're coming to the end of the segment here. I walk away with a sense of cautious optimism in listening to you, that there's going to be a period of time where we're going to see oppression in certain places, like Syria, continuation of that in Iran, but we can also look forward to a liberation in these countries in a few years, as you said earlier. There's hope for the future. And I think there's hope for the future because people like you, whom I've been privileged to know for a number of years, have been really brave enough to say what others were afraid to say, that there needs to be a change in direction, that we can't revert to this kind of repressive thinking that doesn't allow people to question, to interpret. So we go forward with that optimism. I hope I'm not exaggerating. I think I've been somewhat accurate in my estimation.
Yeah, and I thank you. Thank you for that. And I can't tell you how much I ask people to just think about your closest friends and family that have fought cancer. You don't know how it's going to turn out. Some of your friends make it. Some of them go through, don't make it and go through hospice. And same thing with countries. The communities will fight, and they will, through those ashes, as they fight, some will improve. The tribalism may melt away. It may get worse. There's bottom feeders that are going to come out in Syria. The Islamists will pretend to be one thing, and once they get power, they'll become another. Erdogan himself said, democracy is like a train. You ride it till you get to where you need to, and then you get off. He said that when he was mayor of Istanbul. And so these Islamists are doing that. They will do that. But I, as an optimist, I believe in humanity, and humanity has shown that free thinkers who are honest and frank with the people will ultimately win, as long as they don't have external support. And I think what changed, I thought Syria would never change. But when Russian and Iranian help disappeared, it melted away. And also, I have to tell you, and this is pretty radical for me to say this, but if they're going to erect a statue for one person, it'd be Netanyahu, because in Damascus, because that is really the reason why Assad and his military are gone now, and they have a future. It's not a new dawn, but at the horizon, you can start to see light, because not only Assad, but the military is gone.
Amen. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you with us today, and look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, I love your passion, doctor, and your willingness to get in trouble for what you believe. That's fun.
Good trouble, right?
Good trouble.
Good trouble, yeah.
Good trouble.